Washington to talk about the work being done in those states and compare this framework across different states. One thing I'm curious about in terms of the audience, how many people here are from California? California contingent, love it. From Oregon? Woo. Big Oregon contingent, all right. From Washington? Great, we got the Pacific Coast well represented. Anyone from Massachusetts in the room? Okay, I know Massachusetts has, be interested in hearing a Massachusetts perspective after we have this conversation. But yeah, thank you again to everyone for joining us. I'm gonna ask my other panelists to just briefly introduce themselves. Jamie?
Hi. Hello. Hi, everybody. My name's Jamie. I use she, hers pronouns, and I am the lead field organizer with Futurewise, which is a nonprofit up in Washington that works on land use policy.
Hi, everybody. I'm Lorelei Juntunen. I am the president of ECONorthwest. We're an economics consulting firm that does a lot of housing policy research. We're headquartered here in Portland, and most of what I'm going to be talking about today is Oregon specific, but we do have offices in Washington and California and are doing housing work up and down the coast. So bringing that perspective today.
Hi everyone, I'm Julie Fahey. I am a state representative in the Oregon legislature. I represent parts of Lane County, Eugene, Junction City, rural Lane County. I've been serving in the legislature since 2017, and I've been the housing chair since 2020. So, I've focused on housing policy chair. All the things that Tina talked about in the lunch panel are all things that I've been involved in and working on for several years now. And as of a few months ago, I'm now the new majority leader in the Oregon House, too.
Very excited. We're going to start things off. Lorelei is going to talk about the technical framework that they've been working on for Oregon on regional housing needs assessment. So yeah, Lorelei.
Okay, do I get the PowerPoint or do I not get the PowerPoint? I'm fine either way, but okay.
I would have to call somebody in to help you with that. I thought we had this just a second here.
It's fine either way, but I do have some good visual jokes that we won't be able to get to if we don't have the PowerPoint. I can try to explain them to you all, but it just won't land the same way, I guarantee it.
It's a challenge.
Especially after lunch. So I'm guessing it's a no-go. I'm just going to start talking, and if it magically shows up midway through, that also sounds fantastic. I know we weren't supposed to have PowerPoints, but I actually have some numbers and graphs and things that I wanted to share, and it's really challenging to figure out how to do that verbally. So stick with me. So we in Oregon have been working for a number of years on some pretty comprehensive housing reforms, and I know that we've been talking a fair amount about House Bill 2001. You heard it referenced from Tina Ptacek on the stage. That was our missing middle bill. We're talking today about a different bill that was also passed in the 2019 legislative session, House Bill 2003. And it was frankly a little bit of a sleeper bill. It did some really important things. It required local governments in the state of Oregon to begin to produce these things called housing production strategies, which are starting to get at actually the kinds of policies and supports that are needed to build units. But it had this funny little kind of side current that didn't get a lot of attention to develop a new methodology for thinking about how you calculate housing need. And that should be a regional methodology according to the legislation. And we worked on that with the Oregon Housing and Community Services Department over the course of 2019, 2021, somewhere in that range, and developed the methodology and also ran the numbers on housing need for the first time in the state to look comprehensively at, by income, how many units do we need? And those numbers, I think, were pretty eye-opening. I've actually heard them quoted in a couple of the sessions today, and captured the attention of legislators, some of whom may or may not be on this panel, who then directed the Department of Land, Conservation, and Development to move forward with figuring out how to implement this new methodology. So I'm glad we're in a crowd of wonks, because this is a very wonky discussion, but it's also all very real time for us right now. We are we have our sleeves rolled up and are really like trying to think through all of the best practices from our neighboring states and from others that have tried to put in place pro-housing policies and think about what that could look like for us on the ground. So the timing is awesome. I'm loving that I'm seeing people still like working on this furiously. I'm going to be done talking by the time they figure it out. So just to maybe zoom up for a level for a moment here, Oregon has a unique policy context because of our land use planning system. Many of you are aware that in the 70s, we passed a comprehensive statewide planning system that is unique in the country and that requires local governments to plan for 20 years worth of land supply to accommodate population growth and to build that into their comprehensive plans. So that's the thing that's different about Oregon and means that the YIMBY conversation here is kind of fundamentally just a little bit in a different space. We have capacity. We have zoned capacity. There's lots of quibbles about whether we have the right amount, whether it's in the right place, whether we have the infrastructure that's necessary to support it, whether we've figured out how to account for market variables to know whether that capacity is actually available or not. Any number of different ways that you can argue about whether we have enough capacity, but in general, our system is already organized to make sure that we have thought about the capacity question. We need to address some of those quibbles. We need to make sure it's in the right places and that we have enough density. But for the most part, what we're trying to do at this point is transition the system to one that's focused on production. What does it take to actually build the units? So with that in mind, implementing this new methodology means that what we're trying to move toward is more total housing, more affordable housing, and very importantly, more equitable communities, equitable and inclusive communities. So that is the overall goal that we're aiming for. The visual joke that I was going to bring forward is we like to think of ourselves as being better than California. And if you have, any of you have seen those little bumper stickers that say Oregon is above California, that's like my favorite. I don't know why I find it so funny, but I think it's hilarious. So we built heavily from California's system, but we've changed it in some pretty important ways, and are also trying to think about kind of how we design an accountability system that can really work inside of Oregon's unique and specific land use planning system. So I'll try to describe the methodology to you. This is where the visuals start to get really important. The methodology that we came up with has 3 components. One is what you would expect. It's forward-looking. How much growth do we think we're going to have over 20 years? How many households does that equal? And, do we have enough? How many units do we need for those folks? The second is underproduction. So we know we don't have enough units on the ground right now today. How do we account for the fact that we're basically starting in a hole? And then the third component of it is housing for people who are experiencing homelessness. So they're not captured in any of the data sets that we would use to measure underproduction or forward-looking projections. And we know that we have them right now. Shockingly, housing for people who are experiencing homelessness has not been part of the system at the local level that we've developed so far. So we have those 3 components. What happens then is we developed regions for the first time in the state, and we calculate all of that need in those 3 components at the regional level, and then allocate it down to the jurisdictions inside of the region based on regional incomes. And that's the really important piece of it. An underlying intention behind House Bill 2003 was to break the cycle of having affluent communities look at their past trends of housing development and incomes and project that forward and effectively lock in through their planning processes their sort of exclusive nature. So by having that regional distribution, we break that cycle. So that's how the methodology works at a high level. Very happy to answer questions when we get into the details of it. When we ran the numbers statewide, not surprisingly, we found that there's a tremendous amount of need. Forward-looking, just to accommodate population growth, we think we're going to need about 440,000 new units. But to account for underproduction and for housing for people who are experiencing homelessness, units that we need right now on the ground and do not have, we are missing about 140,000 units. So when you add that all up, it means that we would basically need to double the pace of our current housing production for total units and triple the pace of production for units that are for people who are below 50% of median family income. It's broken down by income, and it looks like we would need approximately 30% of the units would need public support to be able to be built. And then an additional 17% are sort of in that range where maybe in some markets you would see the market producing it. Oh, I'm almost done.
Do the visual joke.
Okay, all right, let's do it. We'll go through real fast. Okay, here's the policy context from Ptacek. Great. This is Tom McCall. He was, yes. If you have not read Fire at Eden's Gate, I would really recommend it. It should be required reading for all Oregonians. It's all about Tom McCall. He was, really a visionary and was the force behind House Bill 100, which is our statewide land use planning system. But he was not exactly a YIMBY. If you go to the next slide, he was kind of famous for saying this, which is not exactly the way to welcome your neighbors. You really need to sign more like this one. This was part of the RIP process here in Portland, which I know has been a theme throughout the entire conference. And then here's your Oregon is above California. I want one of those to put on my water bottle, but I don't have one. Okay. All right, now this gets into the methodology. I am really blocking my own view here. How can I be both on the mic and not in the way? Projected need, distributed based on regional income. Underproduction is actually distributed based on the share of folks who are experiencing cost burdening, because we know that underproduction leads directly to cost burdening for people at the lowest end of the income spectrum. And then housing for people who are experiencing homelessness is distributed based on some data that we had available from Oregon Housing and Community Services about the incomes of folks who are experiencing homelessness. Not surprisingly, most of those are in the lowest income bin, but there are some people who are housed, who are unhoused, who are employed and are up even into the 50 to 80% income bracket. So those are then distributed down, some of it inside of our urban growth boundaries and a much smaller portion of it outside of urban growth boundaries, because we do know that some growth will happen there. And then you get to, that's how you get to the local allocation. Okay, moving on. Here's the numbers, which I said all of this just a minute ago, but to reiterate, 29% will require funding, and that is a very large number of units. And this additional 17% here in the middle at the 50 to 80% of median family income is very likely to require at least some funding. Okay. So next up, now that we've completed that methodology, we are now in the process of trying to figure out how to implement it. If you can hit forward for me. So the goal is to use, by the way, we're trying to rebrand this from RENA, which is California's model, to ONA, which is going to be our model. We'll see if it sticks, but just back to that theme of Oregon is above California. We're trying to break that. So the goal of using the ONA methodology is to break the cycle of affluent communities planning for affluent futures and move from this more passive planning for housing to a much more active production-focused approach. And the idea is to use the numbers from the ONA to create production targets that have accountability measures tied to them that local governments would then aim for. And it's been interesting to hear through some of these previous panels, folks talking about the desire to have a sort of commonly agreed upon goal. That's part of the impetus behind this, is to have something that's coming from data that people can understand and agree to and point to as their common goal. We're currently thinking that we would have production targets for total units, and then additionally targets for units that are affordable, rent-restricted affordable, and that we would be working toward providing data that identify communities that have high degrees of segregation, and through the housing production strategies, asking those communities to make proactive plans to work with people who are experiencing housing marginalization in their communities to develop plans to overcome that segregation pattern. And then when it comes to land use plans, we currently have each individual community in the state is doing their own forward-looking projection of need. The ONA numbers would replace that for land use plans. If you can advance, it's like we are real time. I think this is maybe the first time everything that's up there on the screen has been said out loud, and I'm doing it here in front of Representative Fahey and many of you who may eventually be implementers. So it's really important to note that this is draft. We are going through a pretty, I would say timeline-wise, aggressive, but also very comprehensive stakeholder engagement process right now to gather feedback on that. DLCD, the Department of Land Conservation and Development, is leading that effort. Sean Edging is here from DLCD. He's the eye at the center of the ONA storm, and I will probably be pointing to him to answer questions as they come up throughout the rest of this discussion. But this is the framework that we're thinking about. One more thing to just say about the targets is that one of the biggest pushbacks that we've been hearing already in the engagement from our jurisdictional partners is that they don't control the levers of housing production and don't want to be held accountable for making progress toward targets. So what we're thinking about in terms of measuring progress is that we would compare them to a set of peer cities, whether that be other cities in the region or other cities that have a similar market typology and similar dynamics, to see if they're making more or less progress than other cities, and that would be the way that we would measure whether they're achieving enough. So if you can go one more slide forward. Conditions for success. It was really interesting to hear the panel just now at lunch and hear Tina Kotek talking about, go big, build the best policy that you possibly can think about building. And I think if we were to actually do all of this, it would be a massively going big approach. But we have heard and know from our own collective experience that none of this is possible without sufficient funding. And in particular, if you're going to have any kind of meaningful accountability measures or sticks that you can use against jurisdictions that are reticent, there has to be some sort of carrot involved as well. So these things are interrelated, funding and accountability. Administrative capacity is absolutely critical to being able to do this well. In Oregon, we have an agency, the Department of Land Conservation and Development, that does land use planning, and then we have an agency, OHCS, that does housing funding. The two don't interact with each other very much, and there would need to be a lot more interaction in order to implement a comprehensive system like we're talking about here. And then last but not least, our land supply system, I started at the beginning by saying that generally speaking, land capacity is not our problem. That is not to say that it is not without its problems, and it's an extremely litigative process to expand your urban growth boundary and can take sometimes decades to make that work. And some of the measurement pieces are really quite burdensome for local governments. So there's a separate but parallel process that's going on right now to look at questions of making sure that that capacity is actually measured correctly and is available when it's needed. And then last but not least, did I mention funding? We just keep hearing that over and over and over. Without money, none of this is even possible. And in fact, I think from a political perspective, if there's not some meaningful chunk of commitment to implementation, we're going to have a hard time bringing along jurisdictional partners. So that's what we're up to in Oregon. I'm pretty sure, yep, that's the last one. That's what we're up to. It's all in development right now, real time. So this discussion is really going to be fruitful for Sean and for me and for others that are involved in trying to figure out how we make all of this work. Thank you for flowing with the technology. We can probably turn it off now unless anyone wants to look at that slide with the
Oregon is above California. Just keep that up there.
Yeah.
Sorry, California.
Thank you, Lorelei. So Julie, do you want to tell us some about the political context of this? And now that all this information is going to be available to you, what do you do with it?
Sure. So I love following Lorelei because I don't have to explain the problem, right? So we are over 100,000 housing units short in Oregon. Need to double our production overall, triple it in the lower income units, or for lower income units. And, I don't feel like this needs to be said in this audience, but I will say it anyway. Housing abundance needs to be part of the solution. There are lots of other things that get talked about, like in the lunchtime panel, the question about corporate ownership. But we have to build more housing. That has to be part of the solution. So we have been really lucky in Oregon to have strong leadership on this issue with Tina Kotek as speaker. We've been able to do a lot of great things in the last, 5 years in particular, I would say. And it's strong political leadership, but also bipartisan leadership. So we've had some Republicans in the legislature that have really been right along with us in terms of leading, not just, sort of agreeing to do what we want to do, but being right there with us as partners. Jack Zika is a representative from Central Oregon who's retiring, unfortunately. He's my partner in crime on housing things across the aisle. But really, we've had folks that have been committed all along to increasing supply. Housing is a little bit of an unexpected path for me personally. I did not do housing policy when I came into the legislature in 2017. Just not my policy area. And, it's sort of thanks to the leadership of Speaker Kotek that I got involved in it. And also, the very first kind of housing bill that I got involved in was our ADU bill in 2017. So in 2017, we passed a bill, you have to allow ADUs in single-family zoning. And I could not understand why there was opposition to that bill. It was one of those things where I was like, why? Why? I could not get it. And when I really don't understand something, that makes me double down and want to think about it and work on it more. And so that was sort of my, what radicalized you on housing was that ADU bill of why are we having such a hard time with this bill? I don't get it. And so that I was sold ever since, the single family zoning bill and House Bill 2003 in 2019. We've talked a lot about those. I also will just flag, we've made record investments in affordable housing construction in Oregon, particularly in the past couple of years. I think the lunchtime panel question, I would say that's a necessary but not sufficient part of solving our crisis. So, but shouldn't let it go unremarked. Again, love following Lorelei. I don't have to talk about the technical details of the ONA work, but I do want to talk a little bit. I found it really interesting, the goals that you outlined up there, because I jotted in my notes the goals and the outcomes. So we passed House Bill 2003 in 2019 to do that analysis. And then last year in the legislature, we funded what's called a budget note. Very exciting. Budget note to do this work about how to actually implement a regional housing approach. And so DLCD, ECONorthwest, stakeholders have been really hard at work coming up with what are the technical policy methodology recommendations that they're going to bring back to the legislature before the start of the long legislative session next year. In Oregon, we have long sessions every other year and then a short session in the even numbered years. So that process for technical policy development really made sense to me because it is such a technical issue. There are a very limited number of legislators in that building who will be able to go deep and fully understand what we're doing here in terms of the land use system and the changes and the implication of those changes. So having that, the agency lead that work made a ton of sense to us. In terms of goals, here's what I would like to see in terms of why. It's such a technical issue that sometimes it can be hard to translate it into a why, and even harder to translate it to the general public. I've done a couple of media interviews about this topic, and I really struggle to sort of synthesize this so technical to pull up of why are we doing this. So here's my best effort at that. Improved planning for housing. So this is what Lorelei talked about, passive to active. Actually planning for it instead of sort of having it be an outcome of your land use planning system. And then better data in land use decisions. So when we're talking about expanding urban growth boundaries in a community, what is the data we're using to inform that decision? If we switch to this model, my hope is that that data is more reflective of the reality on the ground of how much housing is actually needed, and that it will result in more equitable distribution of housing in the different regions of our state. So that's my sort of overall, that's my, high-level goals of what I'm hoping to achieve here. So the question I think was about the political realities, and so of getting something like this through the legislature. So I have hurdles and challenges we face, and then reasons for optimism. So hurdles and challenges. So one, I already mentioned, it's a very technical subject, and I think what can happen there is in the legislature, people can really easily get pulled sideways if it's a really technical topic that they don't fully grasp and understand. So my worry is it'll be really easy to make counter arguments to legislators, to staff, because it is so technical. So that's one hurdle. I think there is a little bit of a hesitance to tell local governments what to do. You know, we did that in House Bill 2001, and it's going well in some places and not so well in others. So I think there's that general hesitance at the state level of like, if we're going to do this, it really needs to be worth it. The juice needs to be worth the squeeze of telling local governments what to do. And then I just have enforcement mechanisms, which Lorelei said is a real small part of the comment, but I think that's where the rubber meets the road, right? It's like, what happens if you don't meet these new targets? And I made a comment to the panel beforehand when we met before. It was like, I look to California, and there's lots of things we can learn about what's been successful, but also it seems like y'all are suing each other like every other day. So, you know, city, the state. So like, I don't actually want that to happen here in Oregon. So how can we be more collaborative with our cities and our local governments? How can we support them in doing this work and not have it be quite so contentious? So that's definitely on my mind of thinking about, consequences, but also incentives, and how can we use both the carrot and the stick there. The uniqueness of many of our local communities. So we do get a fair amount, we have an ocean and the Columbia River and mountains, and so there are geographic constraints. And I literally was just reading an article about Astoria, where a city councilor or someone, I can't remember, someone from the city said, I don't know how the state expects us to build 1,000 more housing units. We have the river and the coast, and we're hemmed in geographically. And so I think there will be a fair amount of that conversation as well. And then the last thing on my hurdles and challenges just says whataboutism, which I think is very interesting, because in housing, we get it all the time, right? Like, so in healthcare, we passed this bill last year in the legislature capping the price of insulin, capping what people pay for insulin. And there weren't people running around saying, like, this doesn't solve 100% of the problem of prescription drug price affordability, so we're not going to support this bill. But it happens all the time in housing, right? Like, this bill doesn't, the single family zoning bill does not solve 100% of the housing problem, and therefore we should be focused on these other things. And so I fear that will happen in this discussion as well. We had a presentation in our House Housing Committee in February about the work that's happening to develop the ONA, and a lot of the questions that got asked were sort of about other things and not about this. And so I sometimes frame it as like, there's no single magic bullet solution to the housing problem. All we can do is, one thing at a time that will solve 1% of the problem, or 3% of the problem, or, ADUs is like 0.5% of the problem, right? So all those things add up to meaningful progress. I'm not under any illusion that if we implement an ONA, like, that's gonna fix all of our housing problems. It will solve 4% of the problem. I don't know. Lorelei might have a different number than that, but some other percentage of the problem. So reasons for optimism, I think legislative commitment, right? You saw Tina Ptacek, not speaker anymore, but she set the standard for here's how housing abundance is important and how we're going to commit to it as a legislature. And now me as majority leader and House Housing Committee chair, this is something that I am committed to addressing, full stop. So we're going to take it on in 2023. I'm really excited about it. I do think this is a bipartisan topic. Like, we have support for increasing supply amongst the Republicans. I'm real sad Jack Zika is leaving, but someone else will take up the mantle on the other side. And then how Oregon-based housing advocates can help. This is, I think, the tough one. I could just say, like, lobby your legislators, which is really important. You should do that, especially when it comes time, because they will want to know that this is an issue that people are paying attention to, because they're going to hear from their cities or their local governments, whatever it might be, So it's really important to lobby your legislature. I forgot to add one reason for optimism, which is that I think in Oregon, LOC and many of the cities have become much more productive partners in the last few years. So that's in part due to leadership at the League of Oregon Cities, but it's been a lot less contentious in the last couple of years, and so that I think is a sign of optimism as well. So lobby your legislators and, do why I think many of us are here today, which is help shift the narrative about housing abundance. I face this all the time. Even, I'm a Democrat, right? And my Democratic friends sometimes say, well, but what about corporate housing? Or all new housing should be affordable housing? Or all of these other things. Like everyone in this room can do their part to help shift the narrative there and apply pressure from outside the building. So, and then the last thing I will say is more of a message to the people in the room that are doing this work to develop the recommendation, which is, one of my mantras in politics is don't compromise before you have to, but know when you have to compromise. And so don't compromise before you have to. Bring us the legislature, the strongest possible recommendations that you can, and we'll figure out if we need to compromise to get something passed.
Thank you, Julie. So Jamie, first question for you is Washington above Oregon?
We're actually above Oregon and California.
So how is Washington looking at this issue?
Yeah, so I'm here specifically to talk about House Bill 1220, which is sort of Washington's version of this housing allocation legislation that's passed in Oregon and California. And Futurewise, as an organization, played a really big role in helping to write and pass this legislation in 2021. So it's very fresh. We're not so far along in really figuring out the nitty-gritty of how it's going to get implemented. But I'm here to first just give a little background into Washington's wonky land use landscape and why this bill and this particular policy solution felt necessary. And then we'll get into a little of the weeds of what the bill does and where we are in sort of this very preliminary implementation process. So Washington, really similar to Oregon, has something called a Growth Management Act, or GMA, and this guides our land use planning on the county and city levels. And this is a series of state statutes that was first written in 1990, and it requires that our fast-growing cities and counties are developing comprehensive plans for how they'll manage their 20-year population growth projections, and it also offers a lot of tools and guidance to help jurisdictions do that planning. There are 14 goals in the Growth Management Act that are sort of the foundation for comprehensive plans. This is everything from limiting sprawl to protecting critical habitats, planning for transportation, capital facilities. And one of those goals is to plan for housing. So since 1990, housing is ostensibly something that cities and counties should have been planning for through the Growth Management Act. However, Washington, along with so many other states in the U.S., continues to slide further into a housing crisis where we just don't have enough housing, and the housing that is available is deeply unaffordable for most people. So it's really clear that this housing element in our Growth Management Act wasn't actually facilitating a diversity of housing that was affordable to all segments and all income levels. And that's because it's just pretty weak. It lacks teeth. The actual language in the housing element is that jurisdictions should encourage the availability of affordable housing to all economic segments. It's what does that mean? What is it to encourage? You could say anything is encouraging housing. And that lack of specificity makes it really hard to enforce and really difficult to actually require jurisdictions to take meaningful action. So the housing element wasn't working for us. We'd passed 2 other incentive-based policies in the past couple of years. We're seeing a slowdown in the implementation and the use of those incentives. The state continues to fall behind in building housing, and we're really seeing very few local governments actually step up to do the work that needs to be done to address the housing crisis. And all of that inaction has led Washington into its current housing crisis, where we're over 200,000 units short of housing and homes that are available to 80% AMI and below. So something needed to change, and I think for us, looking at what was happening in California and in Oregon, that further state level action really was required to make sure that all communities were doing their fair share of work. And so we started thinking about how we could strengthen the housing element of the Growth Management Act to actually make it an effective tool to address the housing crisis. And so I think some of our goals going into this were how can we rewrite it so it does in fact require that a diverse set of housing options that are affordable to all income levels get built. How do we require governments to actually permit densities that will allow that type of housing to be built? How do we address displacement and implement policies to prevent displacement as we're making these changes in our land use policy? And then finally, how do we reckon with the fact that so many of our past and current land use policies have resulted in racially disparate impacts in our communities, where we're continuing to see BIPOC communities suffering economic, social, cultural, and environmental health hazards as a result of the legacy of housing discrimination across our state. And so in 2021, we were able to introduce and pass a bill that gets us a lot closer to addressing all of those goals, which is really exciting. So House Bill 1220 really considerably strengthens that housing element. It now instructs that governments must plan and accommodate for housing that's affordable to all income levels, which is much better than the previous goal, which, like I said, was to encourage affordable housing. And within that sort of broad umbrella, there are a few more specific requirements, which I'll get into. So within city and county housing elements, they now have to identify sufficient capacity for land for the identified housing need for all income segments. So that includes moderate to extremely low income families. It also includes projected needs for emergency housing, emergency shelters, and permanent supportive housing. Within urban growth areas, jurisdictions now have to create more moderate density housing options, which includes like duplexes, triplexes, townhouses, not limited to that, obviously. And then they have to document barriers and actions that are needed to be taken to achieve that housing availability. So where are the gaps in funding, development regulations, sufficient land capacity, and zoning changes that might need to be made to make that housing availability a reality? The second really important part of this bill is that jurisdictions have to identify current and historic land use policies and regulations that have resulted in racially disparate impacts, displacement, and exclusion in housing, including zoning that may have had discriminatory impacts, the lingering effects of things like redlining and racial covenants, as well as areas that have seen historic disinvestment and lack infrastructure availability. And they have to identify those things and then actually implement policies to start to address and undo a lot of those disparate impacts. And then the final part of this bill requires that jurisdictions are identifying areas that are at a high risk of displacement, which we know can occur with changes in zoning and development regulations and capital investments, and they have to establish anti-displacement policies, really working in community to figure out how do we keep communities intact and keep folks from getting priced out of their homes and needing to move even further away from where they work and go to school. So this is all very fresh. Like I said, we just passed it last year, and right now our Department of Commerce is doing a lot of this work that Lorelei was talking about and just working on what is the projected housing needs for all economic segments, again, including for permanent supportive housing and emergency shelters. Those numbers will get passed off to local jurisdictions to help inform their housing planning. The Department of Commerce is also working on guidance for how to meet the other requirements around anti-displacement and addressing racially disparate impacts. And we do have some funding appropriated from the state legislature, which will go directly to local jurisdictions to help them in this new planning work. So this guidance is still coming out. It will continue to come out over the next several months. In Washington, our cities and counties update their comprehensive plan formally on 8 years. A bill just passed this year that has shifted it to a 10-year update cycle. So every 10 years, they update their comprehensive plans for their new growth projections. Those are staggered, so we don't have every city and county updating in the same year. Our next update cycle is for our 4 counties in the central Puget Sound region, which is some of our largest and fastest growing. Those are due in December of 2024. So that will sort of be our first chance to see how the implementation of this policy goes. And I think we're very excited to continue to learn from what's happening in Oregon and California and to do what we can to make sure that this legislation has the impact that we know it can have and that it really has to have on the ground. And I do just want to, because I'm, a lot of these notes are from my policy colleagues, because I'm not the policy wonk on our team. I work on the grassroots side. So I was really kind of the person who was helping to build the outside pressure that we needed to pass this bill in a year. And I just kind of want to build on what Representative Fahey was saying, that to pass housing bills of this scale and to pass them quickly, to make sure that we're actually addressing the urgency of this crisis, we can't just rely on an inside or grass tops sort of behind the scenes approach. That's definitely really important. We need to have really strong inside game, but to pass big and often controversial housing bills, we also need to be building movements. We need to be bringing together really diverse coalitions of advocates and organizations who are calling on their legislators to take action and are putting them in a position where they feel like they have to act and they can't just do nothing. And this is something that I think our campaign that we ran did really well. While our lobbyists and our legislative champions worked like absolute wonders, if it hadn't have been for the immense grassroots support that we built for this bill, the amount of time we spent doing education and outreach and working in community, consulting with stakeholders and making sure we were getting input on the policy and writing something that felt inclusive, that people could really see themselves in. If it hadn't been for all of that, I don't think this bill would have passed in 1 year like it did. And I think a lot of the strength in that movement that we built was from its diversity and its intersectionality. I know a lot of panels have touched on this already, and I think, this is not news to anybody in this room, but the housing crisis, the climate crisis, issues of racial equity, environmental health disparities, like all of these issues are so intertwined, and to address any one of them, we really have to be thinking about how they all connect and how can we write comprehensive policy that gets at those really intricate overlaps in these issues. And so something that we really focused on in our campaign around this bill was to frame it not just as a housing bill, but as a bill that, like, yes, is going to address housing, but also is going to get us closer to our climate change goals, and also is going to get us closer to addressing the deep racial inequities that we still see across the state. And by doing that, we were able to bring along transportation advocates, housing advocates, climate advocates, folks working in the equity space, and get a really broad group of folks rallying behind this bill. And so I just want to emphasize that, like, that is so important and crucial to this work. And you need folks who know the policy, but you also need people who can tell stories and inspire legislators and people in power to take action. And I will.
Thank you, Jamie. So California may be below Oregon and Washington, but we are also somewhat ahead on having a system like this in place already. I don't know how much pride we really should take in that, though, because the regional housing needs allocation process in California has been in place for several decades. We're in the 6th cycle of RHNA right now, just beginning. And I think it's fair to say that cycles 1 through 5 were not successful in generating abundant and affordable housing in California, or in addressing the state's fair housing challenges. That's what they always say. So I'm going to talk a little about how the process works in California, where it's broken down, what has been done to try to fix that, and how I see that working out. So basic overview of RHNA, it is a layered process. It starts with the state giving each region in California regional housing need assessment. You need this many thousands, hundreds of thousands of new homes over the next 8 years. That's divided up into 4 income buckets: very low income, moderate income, and above moderate income, basically in proportion to the share of the population that falls into each of those income categories. That assessment goes to a regional association of governments, which is in charge of dividing it up among all of the jurisdictions. So you start with, the Association of Bay Area Governments, the Southern California Association of Governments gets their assessment, and they have to come up with a way of getting each city in the Bay Area or Southern California their number. And then those cities respond to that number by developing a local plan. It's called the housing element. If you've seen YIMBYs in California talking on Twitter a lot about housing elements, this is what we're talking about. And that's going to show how they are going to be able to meet this regional housing need allocation. The headliner is they have to do a list of parcels that are adequately zoned to meet all of this housing need, but it also includes a requirement for them to assess government and non-government constraints on housing, propose policies to address those constraints, and an assessment of fair housing. All of this is in the context of 5 statutory goals: increase the housing supply and mix of housing types with the goal of improving housing affordability and equity, promote infill development and socioeconomic equity, and efficient development patterns and greenhouse gas reductions, improve the intra-regional jobs to housing relationship, including for low-wage jobs and affordable housing, balance disproportionate household income distributions, and affirmatively further fair housing. So every step of this process has been inadequate over the past 5 cycles, starting with just the amount of housing the state requires regions to plan for. It hasn't been enough. So everything downstream of that is then going to be inadequate because cities aren't planning for enough housing. At the regional level, the allocation distribution has been pretty inequitable, and historically wealthy and exclusionary cities have been able to manipulate that process to not be required to plan for their fair share. Probably the most infamous case of this is the city of Beverly Hills. We all know Beverly Hills. Beverly Hills in the 5th cycle had an allocation of 3. So only 3 new households who want to live in Beverly Hills. That'll be enough. And then within cities, the plans that cities have produced, they would identify BS sites as having adequate capacity. They would put off doing necessary rezonings. They would not adequately address the policy constraints that they'd placed on housing development. They would concentrate development in lower income or more polluted parts of town or in greenfield sprawl. And all of this is supposed to be reviewed by the State Department of Housing and Community Development, but that department was not empowered to tell cities no, and so they didn't. Over the last several years, there's been an interest from the legislature and from advocates in trying to make this process work better. And so, again, there were problems at every stage of it, so every stage required some policy changes. The regional housing needs assessment were modified to require them to account not just for projected future population growth, but also for unmet current housing needs. So that's as indicated by overcrowding, cost burden, and super commutes. The result is that the assessments for the biggest regions of the state more than doubled. So we're planning for a lot more housing now. There was stronger state oversight of the allocation methodology and how that was divided up among jurisdictions with a particular focus on fair housing. And advocates were much more involved in that process, I think, in the 6th cycle than they were in the 5th cycle. I got to be the designated reply guy for the Association of Bay Area Governments Housing Methodology Committee. It was a lot of fun. There's also been an effort to make the housing element process more meaningful, including new rules about site selection in your inventory. This is another place where I think the engagement of advocates has been tremendously important and has helped put pressure on HCD, State Department of Housing and Community Development, to hold cities accountable. I want to give a shout out here to the Campaign for Housing Elements, which is being organized by YIMBY Law and YIMBY Action. California YIMBY is a member, along with a number of other YIMBY groups, and also to Abundant Housing Los Angeles in LA, who's done some really great reviews of the housing elements in that area. And all of this is in a context in which the legislature gave HCD more authority to hold cities accountable and to say, no, that's not enough, and to have consequences when cities fail to produce adequate plans. And there's, for the first time in California, a consequence if you actually fail to actually build enough housing, which is that qualifying developments get subject to ministerial approval and the city council loses their discretion. How is this working? I think generally the assessment and allocation is where we have seen more of this process play out, and I think that's working a lot better. So that's fantastic. We've also seen the state reject housing elements in a way that they have never done before. So that's very encouraging. I think it's unclear, though, whether the state rejection of those housing elements will lead to meaningfully more housing production. It might. I think it's too early in the process for us to answer that question definitively. But we are still seeing a lot of cities put forward plans that don't really include much in the way of rezoning, that don't really include much in the way of major policy changes, and they're betting that they can basically wear HCD down and get HCD to approve those plans if they do some token adjustments. It's going to be up to us as advocates to hold them accountable. But then I also think it's unclear whether the accountability measures are going to be sufficient. The one that gets the most attention is called the builder's remedy. It's the idea that a city without a valid housing element in California can't deny a proposed development on the basis of inconsistency with the zoning. This is potentially a huge deal. There's a requirement that it be at least 20% low-income affordable or 100% moderate-income affordable. Nobody has ever used it. There are a lot of cities in California now that have housing elements that are out of compliance. It's going to be a real test whether anybody does step forward in those cities to use that builder's remedy. So that's the lay of the land in California. First question I'm interested in hearing from the rest of the West Coast is, having heard all these problems that this system has run into in California, I'm interested which ones you think you have a handle on how to solve and which ones you feel least confident in your ability to solve, which are going to be the greatest ongoing challenge.
The greatest ongoing challenge?
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I feel like I already tipped my hand a little bit about the relationship with the cities, right? That I look at what's happening in California, and I would like to envision a model that is a more collaborative, cooperative model between state and local governments.
Yeah.
In thinking about and designing the methodology, we definitely learned a lot from some of the lessons that you pointed out around the sort of politicized nature of the allocation at the regional level, and just skipped that step entirely. Just like goes from the state to the cities. Like it happens at the regional level only for methodological purposes to get to that regional income distribution and approach something more like a fair share. So that was helpful. Thank you for stepping in that on our behalf. So, so that, I mean, I do feel like the methodology pieces, we've had a chance to do some good learning, but the parts that I'm most concerned about figuring out how to design are really the accountability pieces. And I think it's exactly the same thing that Representative Fahey is pointing at, that at least at this point, I mean, it's all relative. So I would say in Oregon, it feels like we have a relatively more positive conversation going between the state and the locals right now, and trying to figure out how to maintain that while also having a new hammer that you can bring down is going to be a real big challenge. And we have not begun the public conversations about what those accountability metrics will be yet. We've made some hints at it, but we're about to walk into that buzzsaw now.
Yeah, not to sound like a broken record, and we're still very early in the process, so it is a little hard to tell, not having like the full guidance from Commerce and what their allocation actually looks like. But I think with land use requirements in our Growth Management Act in general, accountability is just a really huge issue. With our comprehensive plan process, cities and counties' comprehensive plans are considered or under an assumption of validity. So once they're written and approved by the county or city, they're assumed to be valid unless an outside group like Futurewise or another organization or individual sees it and is like, oh, wait, you guys actually aren't doing what you're supposed to do. I'm going to bring an appeal to the Growth Management Hearings Board, and then they are going to make a decision on whether or not this is like valid and in line with the goals and intent of the Growth Management Act. So it's a little wonky, and I think right now we don't have any like built-in accountability mechanisms for these new housing requirements in general, so that's going to be really interesting to navigate. I would think that our Director of Law and Policy, Tim Trahimovich, is going to have a lot more work to do just bringing appeals to counties and cities in these next couple of years, but hopefully we can move towards a space where it is a more collaborative effort and everybody's working together and it's not so confrontational and just like pulling teeth.
Pulling teeth is exactly what I was thinking of. Is there like a different metaphor that connotes a harder thing? And at the same time, I don't want to be like a Pollyanna. This is all we have to do is come up with the magical enforcement mechanism. Carrot stick mix, and everything will be great with the local governments, right? Like we do. Part of this is, there are some local governments in Oregon that are hesitant to make real change. And so I'm not I'm not going to be overly optimistic about how this is going to play out, but I do think, you know, it probably won't be considered a success if 5 years from now, you know, there's 100 lawsuits about who everyone's fighting each other in the court system. So
Yeah.
so
And I think part of that comes back to just like making sure that we do everything we can to give local governments the support that they need, so that like this is
Yes.
hard work, but to make the planning as easy as possible. So like how can we give really clear guidelines and really clear tools to help do this work, and how can we provide funding so they can hire the staff
Yeah.
and to have what they need to be able to do it well.
resources to do the planning. And I
Yeah.
think it is like, you know, it is a true fact that smaller cities like don't have the planning resources to do some of this work. And so we've tried to be supportive of those local governments in the work, in the bills that we passed in 2019, and we need to continue that for sure. So
It's not just the planning resources, though. I mean, it's also, when you think about communities across Oregon, there's a wide range of different types of development markets. And if our goal is to move toward the production of actual units, and at the same time, we're also talking about building in climate-friendly ways that increase density, and, you know, the market isn't going to do that in a lot of communities across the state. So when we're thinking about funding mechanisms, we have to branch out beyond just thinking about funding for units that are affordable in the way that we typically think about affordable, and think about how we support and fund mixed-use buildings in main streets in suburban communities, and, you know, infrastructure to support workforce development in urban growth boundary expansion areas. And it becomes a much more complicated funding challenge. So just right up there with accountability is how do we, I mean, we know we're not going to have the resources to fund everything that needs to be funded. So where do we start, and how much do we need to start with is another challenge we're grappling with.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting tensions around this process in California politically is it's not just about like technical support for cities. It can also be a very big political challenge for them. We had a lot of cities that wanted this process instead of direct state regulation of land use because it's local control. But the result of that is the full political weight of having to make the decisions that are necessary to meet these housing needs falls on local governments. And they are in sort of a lot of different positions in terms of how willing they are to take that political weight. And so I think that becomes another challenge, is how do you make sure that the local governments, when it comes time for them to make this plan, that they have the political backing that they need for it.
and when it makes sense for the state to step in and be the bad guy. I mean, yeah. So I was talking to a mayor a couple years ago, who I will absolutely not name, who said, you know, sometimes it's better if the state just comes in and makes the decision for us, because the work and the effort that it takes to generate the political will at the local level, and frankly, like, you know, city councilors are, we're experiencing it right now in Eugene with the implementation of House Bill 2001. The city council is going to vote on it in the next, I think, 6 weeks. If you live in Eugene, please contact your city councilor. For real, that was not a joke. Like, please do that. They went through this great process of community engagement. Like, one of the coolest things I have ever done. The Healthy Democracy folks came in, recruited a representative sample of Eugenians, paid them for their time to come and learn about land use and zoning and middle housing. And then those folks put together recommendations to the Planning Commission. I talked to them. It was literally the coolest thing I have ever done as an elected official, was this just super passionate, engaged group of folks who didn't know anything about housing, you know, the month before, housing policy. But they brought their lived experiences and a real commitment to digging in. So anyway, they made that recommendation to the Planning Commission. Planning Commission made a very strong recommendation to the council, and now we're all just like biting our fingernails. Like, is the council actually going to pass this great policy? So contact your folks. Build the political will locally.
Yeah. So, yeah, I see we have some questions in the audience. Rashi.
Hi, Aaron. Thank you for this panel. I think one thing that you may not have mentioned about California, correct me if I'm wrong, is the aspect of cities that end up being non-compliant in the end, or their housing element, losing state funds. And I wondered what Washington and Oregon made about that. I know you said that you wanted to have a more collaborative relationship with local jurisdictions, but just this concept of withholding state funding, or I guess the converse, adding more state funding if local jurisdictions are exceeding or, you know, complying really well.
I mean, I think generally a more collaborative model would be like incentivize. So for cities that are doing the right thing, you know, perhaps a funding source there. But this is where we're sort of in the technical details now of like trying to figure out what that could look like.
Well, and we know the laundry list from all of the other places that are out there. And actually in Oregon, through the land use planning process, there's already this concept of the enforcement order, which already gives the state the ability to take funding away, though it's very rarely used. So that already is there, and it's not all the funding, and it's a small amount. And anyway, nonetheless, that's there and could be strengthened. But we're looking carefully at the builder's remedy. I mean, we're thinking about all the laundry list of tools that are out there, and recognize that it's going to tip the balance of power toward the state. That's fundamentally what's going to happen through this process, and that's the part of this conversation that's so challenging to figure out how to navigate while still maintaining you know, some semblance of collaborative working relationships.
Other questions? Yes.
Great. Thank you for being on this panel. So I'm hoping that we can talk a little bit more about housing production strategies. I'm hoping to write on this for my thesis, for my public policy thesis, and I've really like kind of circled around this of being like, okay, hold on a minute, like, so the housing production strategy is local, but I hope that it doesn't become like a local control thing where you're just kind of sloughing this off to the cities and saying, okay, you have to produce this many housing units, figure it out, what's your strategy going to be, give us your strategy, we'll evaluate whether it's good enough. And so I'm kind of wondering, like at the beginning you said that there might be peer cities that they could be evaluated against. I'm wondering, you know, what those cities would be, and maybe what factors would be present in those possible housing production strategies, like what best practices you could give to cities, because I can imagine being like small town Oregon and being like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? How are we going to implement this and come up with this plan?
So, Sean, I can see Sean like desiring to jump in.
So the way a housing production strategy is set up is it's just supposed to be an action plan that a city above 10,000 takes to recognizing that land capacity doesn't determine whether housing gets built or not. It just has them outline the policies that they're going to either commit to implement or commit to implementing a plan B that will encourage that production of housing. And those are really just evaluated on whether or not a city is making good faith progress towards addressing housing needs. The question here is, should we tie some type of production metric or some type of evaluation that indicates, hey, maybe some cities need to be doing more actually to get towards building more housing. Maybe they need to actually put forward more policies in place. And then maybe on the capacity side of things, maybe there are rezoning implications when they do a housing capacity analysis. Maybe they need to actually be planning for a different type of mix of housing. Because in today's system, they really just plan what has been built in the past, 20, 30 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's tough because housing production strategies are a new thing as of 2019, and we're already talking about changing and strengthening them, but that's fundamentally where most of the action will be, is making those more meaningful documents that are tied to an accountability system and have measurable targets and goals in them.
Yeah. Annie?
Hi, so I'm wondering, in terms of your all's efforts, how you all are approaching the zoning component of what makes a viable affordable housing site, or what makes a viable market rate housing site for that matter. I know in California I worked on some of the reforms there, and there's a lot of focus on like development feasibility over that 8-year period, and doing some amount of analysis on how likely are all of those sites that are going to be a part of that plan to get rezoned in that period of time. So if it's already an office park versus if it's already a vacant site that people are bidding on, that should have a different viability. Is that a component of this program at all for you? And if so, how are you all approaching that negotiation with those local governments, given that it's a hugely speculative exercise, and so it's hard to know upfront what the right answer is, but how are you all approaching kind of that component of this program, given that you're modeling so much from California?
That's one of the things we're not modeling from California. Yeah, I mean, the getting down to site specific is almost impossible to do at the state level. So, but that is where the housing production strategy component comes in, which is locally led to, I mean, we're not anticipating requirements in the HPS, at least not at this point, that would be site specific. But if they're not making meaningful progress toward actually building units and are not paying attention to zoning appropriate amounts for densities that could support that production, that would then become a conversation of some variety with the state.
And so you all are sticking to sort of that zoomed out area plan level as the most granular?
We're sticking to comply. Sean, jump in if I say anything that feels out of school from your perspective here, but we're sticking to make sure that you've got a land use plan that complies with the 19 statewide land use planning goals and a housing production strategy that makes meaningful progress.
Okay, so there's sort of like a high level principles that are adopted.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. We're not anticipating getting down to the parcel level, though the buildable land inventory component of the plan does to a certain extent, and that's one of the big questions about land supply is there's no market feasibility component associated with determining that a land is buildable.
Okay.
So that is an open question, but not one that we are actively talking about. Yeah, right.
Yeah. I mean, so one thing here, it seems like a lot of the system in California, the accountability is focused on the plan. Is the state is going to evaluate your plan and decide whether it's good enough or not. But it sounds like here you may be looking at more accountability for progress toward the actual production.
Yeah.
Does that seem right?
Feels like a good way to frame it.
I think that's smart. Ian.
Thank you. So one of the things that's hard, it's a very speculative project, as was said. And one of the things is, if this were successful, if we were actually, we have a number, if we build 50,000 units a year for X number of years, we'll actually have less of a housing shortage eventually, and rents might start to come down. Is there a vision, or do we have any idea about how we can keep? We'll still not have enough units. We'll still have to keep producing a lot of units. Is there any kind of vision, or do we have any ideas about how we can help cities get units continue to be built even when rents are falling? If this all works out. So it's hard. Lorelei starts to talk about it.
That sounds like a great problem
Yeah,
to
that-
have. Like, please, can we get there?
Great problem to have. I have never even contemplated that problem.
You should think about it. If it works. If we win.
What happens if we're too successful? Is that your question?
Even if, because we think rents are unacceptably high right now.
Yeah.
What if and we're still not getting enough units?
It's a super relevant question for a lot of maybe more edge markets where rents are too high for local incomes but aren't high enough to support the production of new units. And I think that's what I was trying to hint at earlier with the comments on funding, that we're going to have to expand our notion of where we're making our investments beyond the urgent need for affordable units if we actually want to implement this thing statewide.
Yeah, and I think sort of beyond the scope of the panel, but this has got to a question about some of the value capture type policies we sometimes put in place that are premised on high rents and only function in the context of high rents. And if we start bringing rents down, those policies can become counterproductive to continued housing production in that context. All right. So the white hair.
I'm a developer that's been building creative, innovative infill housing for the last 30 years. I'm also living in a city now that ECONorthwest has a contract on to do the land use, the housing needs study, Langley, Washington. There is no land in that town to build anything on, and if there was any land, I would be building. And there is no capacity with the construction industry at this particular point, because most of our serious problem here on the capacity side of the building industry to produce housing. I've been looking for sites for the last 5 years to build infill housing. It's just not available. In Langley, we've been trying to find a site to build 10 single-family homes, 5,000 square foot lots. There's not a single site in the entire town greater than 1 acre that has sewer. There's in the peripheral urban growth area, it's all septic, so we can't get any density on it. So you really got to think about, and I know the Futurewise group, you've got to be thinking about the building industry capacity to deliver these housing units. Because it's not there. We don't have the tradespeople. I'm trying to build a little project right now, and I have a 2-week reservation with a cabinet maker in November to build my cabinet. And if I don't give them the order and provide it, I don't get the cabinets for 6 months later. I mean, this industry is a huge crisis. And it's not zoning. Langley has absolutely eliminated all zoning density requirements. No density, you can build as many units as you can get on a parcel in Langley, Washington as you can possibly get under the new zoning in the entire city. And there's 2 1-acre sites of them. So, and I know the same in Shoreline, I know the same in Kirkland, I mean, I'm talking Washington State here. But you really have a serious land issue, not and building construction industry issue. You can throw all the reduction requirements you want, and it ain't gonna happen.
Yeah, I mean, I often say that, like, our housing crisis requires us to do all the things all at once and at scale. And so the workforce issue in particular is, so, you know, we haven't touched on any of that in this panel, but it's something that we're paying attention to in the legislature. We just passed a big $200 million Future Ready Oregon workforce bill this session, some of which, you know, and are paying attention to things like apprenticeship requirements and others to build up the trades. So it is a focus. It's, you know, it's not something that I necessarily talk about on a panel like this, but it is, you know, you look at, so my degree's in chemistry, okay? I don't know how many people are chemists in here, but yeah. So I think about the limiting reagent. What is the limiting reagent of getting enough housing built? And in some places it's land supply, and in some places it's regulations, and in others it's workforce, or some combination of all three. So we have to be thinking about, you know, if affordable housing funding weren't a barrier, we still would have workforce limitations. And so I think, you know, we have to focus on all of those things, and we still have to do it in ONA. So.
Any closing comments? We're at 3 o'clock. So thank you everyone for joining us. And if you want to keep talking about this, I'm happy to continue conversation about this. Yeah. Thank you also to our panelists. You all were fantastic.
Well, hi. Well, stay here all day. Thank you so much. Thank you for making that work. No, it's totally fine. It made a little bit of levity. It was all good.
Feel good?
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate it.